You think you are protecting your engine block every time you pull into the parts store and grab that bright, shiny jug of premium synthetic oil off the top shelf. You confidently match the exact weight numbers printed directly on your yellow oil filler cap. You honestly think you are doing the right thing, treating your car to the absolute best fluid money can buy. But what if the exact motor oil you blindly trust is quietly wearing your rotating assembly out faster? Not instantly. You aren't going to hear a loud, violent explosion the second you pull out of your driveway. Modern engines are incredibly tough pieces of machinery. They don't just randomly die. Instead, they are slowly tortured to death by hidden problems that owners completely ignore until it is way too late. You don't blow a motor up in one violent weekend. You slowly murder it over 3 years using a series of tiny, invisible mistakes that you honestly think are completely harmless. By the time you finally notice a heavy mechanical problem, it is entirely too late to reverse the damage. Average drivers treat automotive maintenance purely as a reactive event. They wait for a heavy metal part to physically snap in half, or they wait for a dashboard light to start screaming at them, and then they react by paying a massive premium to fix it. But the brutal, physical wear happening under your hood right now isn't a single, explosive event. Engines wear out from microscopic friction events that are repeated literally millions of times over a decade of commuting. And the massive assumption actively killing these blocks is the total belief that if an oil says full synthetic on the plastic bottle, it is automatically delivering top-tier protection. That single assumption is actively costing drivers thousands of dollars in early engine rebuilds. Because two completely different jugs of oil, sitting right next to each other on the shelf with the exact same numbers stamped on the front, can deliver completely different physical results after 100,000 miles. The difference doesn't show up on day one. It doesn't show up at your first routine oil change. It rears its ugly head when the machinery actually starts aging. We have to look exactly at the totally invisible wear curve. It builds up in complete silence. You get microscopic metal loss on your heavy-bearing surfaces. You get increased mechanical friction between the soft aluminum and the heavy steel crankshaft. You completely lose the absolute critical sealing capability of your steel piston rings. You don't physically feel any of this happening from the driver's seat. You just keep driving, totally oblivious, until the engine's raw performance suddenly drops off a cliff. Let me tell you about a guy who came into my repair bay a few months ago. We will call him Carlos. Carlos drives a late-model turbocharged sedan. He absolutely loved this car. He always used a highly marketed, incredibly expensive premium oil that you see heavily advertised on almost every single car commercial. At exactly 140,000 miles, he noticed his engine was aggressively consuming oil. He was physically having to dump a full quart of synthetic into the crankcase every single month just to keep the dipstick sitting in the safe zone. I put his sedan on the massive 2-post lift. We spent 2 solid hours looking for external leaks. The oil pan gasket was completely bone dry. The valve cover wasn't seeping a single drop. There were absolutely no warning lights glowing on his dashboard. The problem wasn't external. It was entirely internal. Years of gradual, microscopic wear had finally caught up to his piston rings. He faithfully followed the exact same maintenance schedule as everyone else. He rigorously used the exact intervals printed in his glovebox manual. But the physical protection that highly marketed oil actually provided simply wasn't enough to survive the violent, blistering reality of a turbocharger. Before we completely tear apart exactly what actually defines a highly protective motor oil, and why you are being heavily manipulated by simple marketing labels, I need to know exactly what kind of climate you are dealing with. Drop a quick comment down below. Tell me exactly what city or state you are watching from today, and tell me exactly what car you are driving. I am always looking at the climates you guys are dealing with. A guy trying to keep his truck alive in the brutal, triple-digit dry heat of an Arizona summer is fighting a totally different mechanical war than a guy doing aggressive cold starts in the freezing dead of a Minnesota winter. The local environment changes the entire chemical equation happening under your hood. And while you are scrolling down there, hit the like button and make sure you are actively subscribed to the channel. I keep pulling the curtain back on the exact stuff the quick lube places and dealerships absolutely won't tell you, because relying entirely on a colorful marketing label is a massive mechanical trap. Let's completely simplify what actually keeps your engine out of a scrap pile. It comes entirely down to absolute physical film strength. This is the raw mechanical ability of the fluid to keep heavy metal from physically touching other heavy metal. Engines built today are not the loose, sloppy V8s from 40 years ago. The physical clearances between the moving parts are microscopic. You heavily rely on the oil pump to constantly force liquid under extremely high pressure directly between those metal parts. That highly pressurized liquid physically forms an invisible, unbreakable wedge. If your incredibly expensive synthetic oil possesses weak film strength under extreme heat, that protective wedge completely collapses. You get an instant spike in raw, physical friction. More friction translates directly into heavy mechanical wear. It is basic, undeniable engineering. Then you have the massive issue of chemical stability over time. A lot of these highly marketed synthetic blends start out incredibly strong right out of the plastic bottle. They run incredibly smooth for the first 2,000 miles. But then they physically degrade. The intense heat aggressively rips their molecular chains apart. Mechanics strictly call this mechanical shearing. The oil entirely loses its physical thickness. It starts strong but totally loses its protective capability completely halfway through your factory oil change interval. You are essentially trying to lubricate heavily loaded steel bearings with hot spit. The third absolute critical factor is internal engine cleanliness. A truly premium oil has to aggressively clean the block while it works. When a cheap or rapidly degrading oil breaks down under physical stress, it completely bakes into a hard, gritty carbon deposit right inside the oil passages. Those heavy deposits totally plug up the microscopic oil galleries inside your engine block. They violently block vital oil flow, they violently increase localized heat spots, and they entirely destroy the mechanical efficiency of the motor. A physically clean engine guarantees a significantly longer life. But here is the absolute craziest part that almost nobody understands until they are standing in my bay holding a heavy repair bill. A specific brand of oil can be incredibly clean, heavily packed with raw detergents, but actively cause the metal to wear faster simply because the extreme pressure additives are structurally weak. Or an oil can be incredibly physically strong, but cost an absolute fortune and degrade way too fast in heavy stop-and-go city traffic. Or it can be perfectly mechanically balanced and outlast absolutely everything else sitting on the auto parts shelf. Average drivers completely refuse to look beyond the shiny plastic bottle. They buy exactly what their dad bought 20 years ago, or they blindly grab whatever bottle has the brightest graphic of a race car printed on the front. They honestly think they are outsmarting the system or providing elite care for their daily driver. They completely fail to realize they are actively pouring a heavily compromised liquid into a machine that absolutely requires pinpoint mechanical protection. We are going straight into the exact physical differences between how a basic commuter car silently destroys fluid versus how a heavily loaded turbocharged engine physically tears oil apart. You have to totally realize that the motor does not operate in a physical vacuum. It takes a brutal, heavy beating from the exact way you push the gas pedal and the exact environment you force it to survive in. Let me know if you guys have ever pulled the dipstick right before an oil change and smelled pure, raw gasoline completely saturating your heavy synthetic fluid. That distinct, aggressive smell is actively telling you something absolutely terrifying about the mechanical health of your block. When you pull that dipstick out of the tube and your heavy synthetic oil smells strongly like a gas pump, you are staring directly at a massive mechanical failure in progress. Raw liquid gasoline is physically washing past your steel piston rings. It drops aggressively straight down into your oil pan. Gasoline is an incredibly powerful solvent. It entirely breaks down the complex chemical structure of your motor lubricants. You could pour the absolute most expensive, hyper-premium racing fluid into that block, and if you have a fuel dilution problem caused by constant idling or a cold-running engine, that high-end oil physically turns into useless water within 3,000 miles. This leads directly into the exact difference between buying oil based entirely on a colorful label and buying a fluid engineered specifically to survive the raw physical reality of how you actually drive. Let me contrast Carlos and his destroyed turbo sedan with another guy who brings his car to my shop. We will call him Marcos. Marcos drives the exact same automotive platform. He has the same engine displacement, the same heavy turbocharger bolted to the exhaust manifold, and the same factory horsepower rating. But Marcos totally ignored the massive, flashy marketing displays at the front of the auto parts store. He didn't just blindly grab the brand everyone instantly recognizes from television commercials. He picked a specific formulation renowned entirely for its extreme shear stability. This is an oil heavily engineered by actual chemists to aggressively maintain its physical viscosity under brutal thermal stress, completely sacrificing aggressive marketing budgets for raw physical performance. The results are literally sitting right there on my heavy shoplift. Marcos is aggressively pushing 200,000 miles on the original rotating assembly. We pull his spark plugs and do manual compression tests, and the cylinders are incredibly tight. The gauge jumps right up to factory spec. He has absolutely zero oil consumption between his regular changes. No top-offs. No weird burning smells drifting into the cabin when he sits at a red light. Absolutely no thick blue smoke pouring out of the tailpipe on a cold morning. You have two entirely different drivers operating the exact same piece of heavy machinery, achieving a totally different mechanical outcome purely because of the physical chemistry sitting inside their respective oil pans. This brings us to the absolute biggest trap average drivers fall into, completely convinced they are taking perfect care of their investment. You completely trust the digital screen glowing brightly on your dashboard. Automakers right now are heavily pushing 10,000-mile, sometimes even 15,000-mile oil change intervals. They actively want you to think the car is virtually a maintenance-free appliance. It aggressively helps them sell brand new cars to people who absolutely hate visiting repair shops. But the heavy metal rotating assembly sitting under your hood violently disagrees with that digital service screen. When you stretch an oil change to 10,000 miles, you are entirely ignoring the brutal reality of the chemical additive package suspended inside the fluid. Quality motor oil is heavily packed with aggressive detergents, active dispersants, and extreme pressure anti-wear compounds like zinc and molybdenum. Those specific chemicals are entirely sacrificial. They literally do their job by physically getting destroyed, so your heavy steel bearings don't have to. By the time you hit mile 6,000 in heavy stop-and-go traffic, those protective additives are largely depleted. The chemical armor is gone. If you stubbornly keep driving for another 4,000 miles, just because the dashboard light hasn't turned on yet, you are forcing your internal engine components to survive on highly acidic, totally exhausted fluid. The liquid is technically still physically sitting inside the pan, but the actual mechanical protection is completely dead. You absolutely cannot push those extended intervals if you are stuck doing short, 2-mile grocery runs every single week. When you fire up a freezing cold engine block, the physical metal clearances are slightly loose. The pistons haven't expanded to fit the cylinder walls tightly yet. Because of that gap, massive amounts of moisture and raw, unburned fuel physically condense on the cold aluminum walls inside the block and wash directly into the oil supply. If you only drive a few miles down the road, the oil never physically hits the 212 degrees necessary to actually boil that toxic moisture entirely out of the crankcase. You are actively mixing standing water and motor oil together. You physically manufacture a highly acidic, heavy yellow milkshake that aggressively eats the soft, delicate metal bearings inside your engine. Now, if you are a driver doing 90 miles a day on an open, totally flat interstate, your engine lives in a completely different physical reality. The RPMs stay steady. The heavy oil temperature stays perfectly hot. The PCV system actively sucks all that destructive moisture and raw fuel vapor completely out of the crankcase and safely burns it inside the combustion chamber. The oil stays incredibly clean. In that highly specific scenario, your fluid easily survives a significantly longer interval. But 90% of you watching this do not operate your vehicles like that. You sit in brutal, dead-stop city traffic. You idle in school pickup lines for 20 solid minutes with the air conditioning blasting. You aggressively accelerate up steep on-ramps. That is severe-duty driving, and it radically accelerates exactly how fast your physical fluid dies. Add a modern turbocharger to that stop-and-go traffic, and you multiply the mechanical stress exponentially. A turbo relies completely on a constant, high-pressure flow of your engine oil to physically cool a central metal shaft that is violently spinning at well over 100,000 revolutions per minute. The raw exhaust gases cooking that cast-iron turbo housing regularly exceed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. If you run a cheap, poorly formulated synthetic oil that severely lacks high thermal stability, that raw heat physically bakes the liquid oil directly onto the internal bearings the exact second you turn the ignition key off. The stagnant oil boils and turns into hard, gritty black rocks. Mechanics strictly call this oil coking. Those heavy carbon rocks eventually plug the tiny metal feed lines completely solid. The turbo entirely starves for lubrication, the internal metal shaft snaps in half at high speed, and you hear a terrifying noise that sounds exactly like a loud dentist drill coming through the firewall. You are immediately staring at a massive $3,000 mandatory repair bill purely because your cheap oil couldn't handle the heat cycle. And what happens when that engine block finally crosses 120,000 miles? Most drivers just blindly keep pouring the exact same water-thin factory oil into the block, totally ignoring the fact that the internal machinery has physically altered. After a solid decade of hard driving, your steel piston rings naturally wear down. The physical gaps between the rapidly moving parts get slightly wider. If you stubbornly keep pouring an ultra-thin viscosity into an aging engine, that thin fluid blows straight past the heavily worn rings and actively burns directly inside the combustion chamber. Your highly expensive catalytic converter aggressively melts from the raw oil contamination. You have to actively adapt your maintenance to the physical state of the metal. High-mileage engines desperately need an oil with a highly robust film strength to physically seal those slightly widened gaps, completely restore the lost compression, and stop the heavy oil consumption dead in its tracks. Another massive mistake I see happening constantly is the cheap oil trap at the big box stores. A guy walks down the aisle, sees the premium stuff sitting there for $45, and then spots the house brand right next to it that proudly says, "Full synthetic," for $22. He buys the cheap stuff, totally convinced the government heavily regulates the labels, so it must be the exact same chemical formulation inside the jug. It absolutely is not. The automotive industry fought a massive legal battle decades ago regarding the word synthetic. Today, highly refined conventional base oils can legally be labeled and heavily sold as full synthetic, even though they are just heavily processed dinosaur oil. You are not getting a true, top-tier engineered chemical molecule. The cheap oil severely lacks the raw physical endurance required for high-stress driving. Under a heavy mechanical load, the long molecular chains inside that cheap oil shear down violently fast, dropping your protective viscosity entirely out from under your heavy bearings. I want you to go out to your driveway tomorrow morning, open your driver's door, and actually look at the clear service sticker the dealership or quick lube place slapped on your upper windshield. What is the exact mileage gap they are telling you to wait? Are they aggressively pushing you to leave that fluid in the block for 10,000 miles? Let me know right down in the comments exactly what that sticker says. Because blindly following that single printed number without understanding the absolute physics of your own daily commute is the exact reason my shoplifts are completely booked out for weeks at a time. Here is what most people severely underestimate. A tiny fractional difference in oil thickness and chemical quality violently compounds over a decade of driving. You think you are saving a few dollars by blindly pushing your oil changes to 10,000 miles because the dashboard light says it is perfectly fine. You think the thin, watery 0W20 the factory demands is an absolute engineering requirement for the engine to survive. That owner's manual sitting in your glove box is a heavily compromised document. It is not a pure mechanical Bible written by engineers trying to make your car hit 300,000 miles. The exact oil weight printed on your filler cap is a highly calculated decision driven heavily by federal emissions regulators and corporate accountants. Automakers are absolutely desperate to squeeze every single fraction of a mile per gallon out of these modern engines to hit strict federal fuel economy targets and dodge massive corporate fines. The absolute easiest way to make an engine highly efficient on a government laboratory test is to fill the crankcase with extremely thin fluid. The heavy metal oil pump doesn't have to work as hard to push that watery 0W20 through the block. The crankshaft spins slightly freer. The automaker gets to slap a shiny green fuel economy sticker on the window at the dealership. But raw efficiency and physical heavy metal protection sit on entirely opposite ends of the exact same physical spectrum. If you take that exact same car, with the exact same engine code, and ship it directly to Australia, the factory manual suddenly explicitly recommends a thicker 5W30 or even 5W40 oil for the exact same block. The internal bearing clearances didn't magically change. The regional emissions regulations changed. The manufacturer fully knows that if you take water-thin 0W20 into the brutal heat of the outback, the engine will completely cook itself to death. They actively prioritize real-world physical protection the absolute second the government regulators look the other way. Almost every single modern vehicle rolling off the assembly line today uses gasoline direct injection. GDI entirely changed the physical rules of engine wear. Instead of spraying fuel softly into the intake manifold like the old days, a direct injected engine violently forces raw liquid gasoline straight into the highly pressurized combustion chamber at thousands of pounds per square inch. When the engine is cold or you are idling in heavy traffic, the internal combustion is not perfectly efficient. Tiny amounts of that raw, liquid gasoline physically wash past the steel piston rings and drop directly down into your oil pan. Mechanics call this fuel dilution, and it is the absolute silent killer of modern engines. Gasoline is a highly aggressive chemical solvent that entirely breaks down lubricants. When you start with an ultra-thin, factory-mandated WW20, you have absolutely zero physical margin for error. The raw gasoline hits the thin fluid, violently attacks the chemical base stock, and aggressively thins it out even further. You are suddenly driving down the interstate at 70 miles an hour, trying to protect heavy steel bearings with a fluid that has the exact physical consistency of warm iced tea. The 0W20 completely shears down. The protective wedge entirely collapses, and the metal physically touches. When you force a heavily stressed, ultra-thin fluid to stay in the crankcase for 10,000 miles, the absolute worst wear happens entirely out of sight, right at the front of your engine block, your timing chain. Decades ago, timing chains basically lasted the entire life of the car because they were heavily bathed in thick, robust oil. Today, replacing stretched timing chains is a massive, highly profitable industry for repair shops. A timing chain is made of hundreds of tiny metal links held together by microscopic steel pins. Every single one of those heavy pins absolutely requires a thick, robust cushion of oil to keep the metal from physically grinding away as the chain violently whips around the gears at thousands of revolutions per minute. When you run thin, fuel-diluted oil for 10,000 miles, that physical cushion entirely ceases to exist. The metal pins aggressively scrape against the links. Microscopic amounts of steel wear away from every single joint. You multiply that tiny wear by hundreds of links, and the entire chain physically elongates. It physically stretches. The engine jumps mechanical timing, the valves violently smash into the top of the pistons, and your motor instantly turns into a massive piece of scrap metal right there on the highway. When you force a heavily stressed, thin oil to stay in the crankcase for 10,000 miles, those protective additives are completely dead by miles 6,000. You are driving the last 4,000 miles on absolutely nothing but sheared, depleted, highly acidic fluid. The engine block starts baking the raw heat straight into the metal. Heavy, black carbon sludge violently bakes onto your delicate variable valve timing solenoids. The tiny oil return holes in your piston rings completely clog solid with hard carbon rocks, and suddenly your engine starts aggressively burning a quart of oil every 1,000 miles. You cannot reverse that damage with a $12 bottle of Magic Engine Flush from the auto parts store. Once the metal is scored and the rings are permanently glued to the piston with baked carbon, your engine is on an irreversible countdown to a massive failure. You completely avoid this massive repair bill by building a bulletproof defense strategy right now, long before the metal actually breaks. You throw the factory manual in the trash, and you adapt strictly to the physical reality of how you actually drive the machine. If you live in a hot climate and spend your mornings dragging a heavy metal chassis forward 10 feet at a time in dead-stop city traffic, you are aggressively cooking the fluid in the pan. In that highly specific environment, you step up the viscosity. You move completely away from the water-thin 0 Wallers of 20, and you pour a high-quality, full synthetic $5 at 30 directly into the crankcase. You give the heavy metal bearings the physical structure they are desperately begging for. You build a hydrodynamic wedge that absolutely refuses to collapse when the temperature aggressively spikes. You completely protect the timing chain pins from the aggressive mechanical shearing. Now, you never wildly jump 3 or 4 grades of viscosity. You don't drain your 0W20 and dump heavy, thick 15W40 diesel oil into your modern 4-cylinder. Modern engines are built with microscopic, laser-cut internal clearances. If you put excessively thick oil into those tight tolerances, the heavy fluid cannot physically squeeze through the tiny gaps fast enough. The thick oil literally backs up inside the pump. Your oil pressure gauge might look absolutely fantastic on the dashboard, but that high reading is completely fake. It is pure physical resistance. While you are staring happily at a great pressure gauge, the entire top end of your engine is completely starving for actual lubrication. The metal runs bone dry, violently overheats, and the camshaft physically snaps in half. Oil pressure is the raw physical force of the fluid pushing against the block. But oil flow is the actual volume of fluid physically moving through the galleries to carry intense heat away. Confusing the two is a fatal mechanical error. You have to completely stop treating your motor oil like a generic liquid you just casually pour into a hole. You absolutely must treat it like a highly specific, totally invisible mechanical component. The greatest trick the automotive industry ever pulled was entirely convincing millions of drivers that an engine block naturally degrades and fails at 150,000 miles. They want you to accept a massive car payment every 5 years. Engines do not just randomly break. They are slowly, aggressively tortured to death by owners who blindly follow a maintenance schedule heavily designed by corporate accountants instead of mechanical engineers. You completely stop listening to the digital dashboard telling you to wait 10,000 miles. You pull that drain plug absolutely every 5,000 miles. No exceptions, no excuses. You get the highly acidic, heavily fuel-diluted garbage entirely out of the engine block, and you put fresh, aggressive chemical additives directly back into the fight. The factory manual strictly protects the manufacturer from federal emissions fines. Choosing the absolute right fluid based entirely on your physical driving reality protects your bank account. If this breakdown completely changed the way you look at the yellow cap sitting under your hood, do me a massive favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below and tell me the absolute highest mileage you have ever personally put on an engine block before it finally gave up. I read through every single one of those stories, and I guarantee the guys hitting 300,000 miles are not doing it on 10,000-mile intervals with water-thin oil. Stop feeding your heavy metal cheap, compromised fluid, dictate the machinery, and I will see you in the next one.